In its 168 years, the Capitol building in Washington has seen legions of legislators come and go. 35 years ago, an obscure congressman from central Illinois arrived to take his seat for the first time. He is still here. Everett Dirksen, now the senior senator from Illinois, is still on the move. So many people want to see him today that the rug on his waiting room floor must be replaced every other year. The senator and I were to meet in the small rotunda of the Senate wing, the Capitol's oldest section. Its cornerstone was laid by George Washington in 1793. This was a fitting place to meet one of the Capitol's longest residents, to talk of its history and of the momentous years he had spent here.
Well, Mr. Smith, fancy seeing you here.
Senator, of all the 100 senators and 430 congressmen, you look most at home in these surroundings.
Well, I've been here long enough, a third of a century, either on one end of the Capitol or on the other.
Senator, when Congress first came here in 1800, I understand that this section was all that was up.
Yes, this housed just about everything that the federal government had.
Now, I wonder why we can't economize that way today.
Wouldn't it be wonderful now when you stop to measure it against the gargantuan dimensions of the government today?
These columns here, they have a special interest, I understand. They're parts of the oldest parts of the building.
Yes, this little rotunda, as we call it, was the first one to be built as a part of this wing, of course. And you'll notice the tobacco leaves for decorations here. That was a little fillip to that very distinguished President, Thomas Jefferson, because Jefferson was a great experimenter with all manner of agricultural commodities. And among other things was tobacco. He regarded tobacco as our basic American crop at that time.
When did you first come to Washington?
I was elected in 1932 and came to that first celebrated 100-day session under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And there's been a lot of history, as you so well know. And of course, if there was a chance to get in a political plug, which I'm not going to do, I might tell you who might be the next president of the United States after 1968.
I see.
But maybe I'd better not do this.
Don't restrain yourself.
Yes, but we don't want to offend
It's not
anybody,
unknown that politicians talk about politics.
Oh, sure they do.
Since his Capitol years started in the House of Representatives, it was to that side of the building that we headed. I asked him if he could recall his impressions when he arrived here back in 1933.
Obviously, I'd never been in Washington, and I never saw this building in my life till I came here as a member of Congress. I was then 36, 37, and you can imagine the impression it made on a boy from the country who had never been here. It was just overwhelming, every part of it.
Which of the two houses did you enjoy the more?
Well,
serving?
I had the greatest affection for the House of Representatives and for its informality.
Most of the work of the House and Senate is done in committee. We stopped in one of the ornate meeting rooms of the House Appropriations Committee. With the portraits of some of its former chairmen looking down, Mr. Dirksen talked of his committee experiences, including work on the nuclear test ban treaty, which he helped to pass in 1963. I would guess that you came here at the peak of the Depression or the depth of the Depression, and this must have been about the most important committee there was at that time.
I remember one thing that has never been fully disclosed, and that was we had to hide money in appropriation bills when it looked as if the public wasn't quite ready for it. That's what happened in the so-called Manhattan Project, out of which came the atomic bomb.
Oh, yes.
You had to hide lots of money.
When you hid money for something like the Manhattan Project, did you know what you were hiding it for?
We had an idea, but nobody else did.
The vice president at that time didn't know about it.
But he didn't know about it, no. And of course, you resort to the prolixities of language in order to hide money in appropriation bills.
The philosophy of the nation has changed radically about government spending since those days, has it not?
Yes, when I came here, the entire budget of government was about 3 1/3 billion. That was for everything. Army, Navy, all the civilian agencies of government, everything, about 3 1/3 billion. Now our administrative budget for the present fiscal year is 135 billion. I remember when I first knew Reed Smoot, the Mormon senator from Utah. I didn't know him well, but I mentioned once to him that I was astounded the way government grew money-wise. And he said, my boy, it'll never be different. He says the country goes from one plateau to another, always in an upward direction. And the other day, I saw a speculative item on the budget to the effect that at the rate of growth, we'll see the time when our budget will be close to $750 billion. Now, $750 billion is 3/4 of a trillion. We haven't quite gotten accustomed to that word trillion yet.
Senator, in that period when you first came here, already the issue of intervention versus isolation was beginning to grow. Would it show up in a committee like this?
Yes, it would, because in these requests for money, where agencies had to articulate their functions, depending on how intense your convictions were with respect to isolationism or interventionism, you just held hold of the purse strings, held them tight. And it showed up in that fashion.
You were from the Middle West. When did you make the transition from isolationism to interventionism?
Don't quite remember, but there was a point where I remember that I made a short speech on the floor of the House, and it was carried in full on the editorial page of a great many newspapers. There's a certain something that gets into your consciousness, and that's probably it. Call it understanding, if you like. And then, of course, in due course, in my time, came the second of the wars. See, I served in the first one on the front. My son-in-law, from Tennessee, who is now in the United States Senate, was in PT boats like the late President John Kennedy in the Pacific. That was War II. Now I've got a grandson coming along who will be 14, and I've been thinking about him. That's why this thing implants itself into your sensitivity when you think about war, and that had a lot to do with hardening up my attitude on the nuclear bomb. I thought, goodness, can't we find an answer to all this before that time happens, because he only has to go 4 years, and then he'll be ready to be grabbed by the conscription route, as you know, and that's not a long time.
Near to the committee rooms and in the center of the House wing of the Capitol is the chamber itself.
Howard, we might take a look at the chamber of the House of Representatives. There are 435 members in the House. They do not assign any seats to the members because of the size of this body. Now, if you'll notice the podium, that's where the Speaker of the House sits. And on each side of him are portraits of Marquis de Lafayette and a beautiful portrait of George Washington. You'll take a look at the center aisle. It automatically divides the parties. Now, it's here where the President comes to deliver the State of the Union message and to address joint sessions, and where chiefs of state coming to countries also address joint sessions. There have been some very momentous speeches delivered in that chamber.
What is the hardest decision a member of Congress has to make?
Well, war would be a decision like that. The nuclear bomb would be such a decision. Most anything that's got blood and death and loss of treasure, everything else attached to it, becomes a difficult decision. Now, I've seen members, as a matter of fact, confronted with a decision that had such intense conviction about it that they'd actually weep and even say, I'm going to leave here, I'm going to quit. I'm not going to go through this agony anymore. And that's something now to see a grown, mature, competent person really weep tears over a decision. I think it's an answer to those who think this is just a bundle of cynicism down here. Well, it is anything but, because we feel as deeply about these matters as do the people. Howard, it's well to take a look at the prayer room, which was established in 1954 here in the Capitol. The members can come here and get the peace and joy and solitude that the soul so desperately needs in moments like that. You'll notice that stained glass window which shows George Washington at prayer. And then the quotation is from the 16th Psalm. Beautiful thing, preserve me, O God, for in thee do I put my trust. It is indeed a very inspiring place.
Everett Dirksen's Washington continues after this word from the B.F. Goodrich Company.
There's a part of the Capitol building which Senator Dirksen and I now entered, where the great collection of statues is kept, donated by the home states of those being honored. From the South, statues of Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and Robert E. Lee of Virginia, leaders of the Confederacy. From New England, the founder of Rhode Island, Roger Williams. The Franciscan missionary to California, Junipero Serra. And from New York State, Robert Fulton. One statue which attracted us, as it does most visitors, was that of Will Rogers, the noted humorist of the 1920s and 30s.
I knew Will Rogers slightly. I knew his son much better, because his son served in the House of Representatives when I was there. He, of course, didn't have Will's humor, I can tell you.
When Will's friends once suggested that they would place a statue of him in the Capitol, what he replied was this: well, if you do, put it where I can keep my eye on Congress. So here he is, and right in the midst of it. And you see him looking right into the chamber of the House of Representatives.
But he's a great fellow, and of course one of the great humorists of our time, and such delightful and refreshing humor, as you so well know.
I suppose the sense of humor you're famous for has been a great help to you in many ways.
Oh, yes. You know, you can illustrate things with humor when you can't do it any other way. Lincoln knew that. And I think I told you once before, when they got out this new issue of greenbacks in the Civil War, somebody said to him, I suppose it was Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury, is there an inscription for these? And Lincoln puzzled for a moment and said, what was it that Peter said to Paul? Silver and gold have I none, but such as I have, I give thee. I thought that was delightful. Now, there's one other thing about humor that I should mention, and this reminds me of it. It has a biological effect. You can talk to an audience for 20, 30 minutes, and maybe they get just a little weary, particularly if the speaker's high up and you sort of crank those neck muscles, and their eyes begin to close a little. At that point, a good story, one that they call good for a belly laugh. The blood comes out, and they're just as pierced and lively as they ever were. And that's the magic of the story I've discovered. Now, there are things here in Statuary Hall, good many of them, and I think we ought to take our way over there to have a look at some of these other interesting things.
History and architecture have made Statuary Hall a hall of echoes. From 1807 to 1857, it was the House chamber until its unusual acoustics and a growing membership caused it to be vacated.
This is a rather celebrated place here. See, the House of Representatives met here, days when Lincoln was in Congress. He was elected for one term, 47 to 1849. John Quincy Adams, served here when he got back to the House. I had remarked on occasion, and he wrote in his diary, which is an interesting thing, that he didn't get nearly so much thrill out of being elected president as he did out of having been elected to the Congress of the United States. That, of course, I can pretty well understand. So,
what is this brass...
Now, this brass marker is set approximately where Adams sat and where he suffered his final fatal attack. There's a peculiar acoustical quality about this hall, known as the whispering echo.
And I presume I could demonstrate that to you because the spot is over on this side. This is Everett Dirksen, member of the United States Senate. I hope, Howard, that you hear me. Can you hear me?
That's remarkable.
Yes,
This is a bad room to keep secrets in.
You know, it is said that Adams made use of that echo by eavesdropping on what the opposition was planning and then outmaneuvering them here in this hall.
I see William Jennings Bryan here. He shared with you the qualities of an orator. Have you ever heard him?
Oh, yes. But look, he's in very interesting company. Senator LaFollette of Wisconsin, Senator Long of Louisiana, and Senator, or Bryan, not Senator Bryan, but William Jennings Bryan, twice a candidate for the presidency of the United States. Incidentally, he was born in Salem, Illinois.
Did you ever hear Bryan speak?
Oh, yes, I heard Bryan out home when I was a lad of high school age. But I got engaged in an oratorical contest down in Lexington, Kentucky. That's a good many years ago, when I was a student at the University of Minnesota. Bryan was a featured speaker, and all the contestants came in. I saw him at breakfast all alone at the hotel, and I thought, here's my chance. So timidly, I walked up and said, Mr. Bryan, my name is Dirksen. I come from Illinois, and you were born in Illinois. I'd like to ask you two questions. He said, my boy, what are they? I said, I've noticed that you made that huge crowd here, and you didn't have all these amplifying gadgets that we have today. Oh, he says, that's very easy. All you have to do is talk to the last row in the audience, and everybody else will hear you. I said, I've got one more question. I said, what do you do about these newspapers that say these mean and evil things about you? Oh, he said, my boy, I don't read them. I've done that way myself.
Senator, you were talking about speaking. How important is it to be a good speaker in Congress today?
Well, what is speech, after all, except an instrument or a vehicle to convey a thought? And of course, the more crisply and precisely and clearly it's done, the better. Because after all, that is your instrument, particularly in public life. And you should be able to emphasize what you're going to say, but over and above everything else, clarity, and make it clear to the person who is listening.
Do you think that any votes or minds are ever changed on the floor of either house by
speech? Yes, not often, but sometimes. And it depends on the nature of the subject matter and obviously on the type of a speech you make. I think it's happened twice to me, once on civil rights, because I dug out that quote from Victor Hugo, allegedly written the night he died in his diary, when he said, an idea whose time has come is stronger than all the armies on earth.
What was the other time?
The other time was on a sugar bill, and it was late at night, and I prepared for it, and we had a full chamber, and I laid into it, and well, several members came down and said, you've changed some votes. Now, you hear it from your members. You're not particularly conscious of it yourself until they tell you. Now, this is the great Rotunda. It's the center of the Capitol. It joins the House and the Senate wings. The dome is made of cast iron, and it's the third largest dome in the world. In Civil War times, this served as a barracks and as a hospital. And in this same hall, Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy, as well as our other martyred presidents, lay in state. But 2 floors beneath the center of this rotunda is a tomb that was actually built for the bodies of George and Martha Washington. But you see, the rotunda was not completed until long after the Washingtons had passed on. Well, in the nature of things, their family decided not to disturb the graves at Mount Vernon. And that's where they lie today. But overhead, Washington looks down on the rotunda in a giant painting by the artist Brumidi, who decorated so much of the Capitol. It's called the apotheosis or glorification of Washington. You see him with freedom and victory seated beside him, and then the 13 figures that represent the original 13 states surrounding him.
The Rotunda is indeed the Hall of Presidents. There are statues here of the great generals who became chief executives. George Washington, Major General Andrew Jackson, hero of the War of 1812. The Civil War's General U.S. Grant. There are the humanists, such as Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of Independence, who rose to lead the nation, and the great emancipator himself, Lincoln.
The standing figure of Lincoln is the only one that was actually done from life. Strangely enough, it was sculpted by a young girl. She was only 17 years old. Her name was Vinnie Ream. She got Lincoln's permission, I expect in large part, first because she was only 17, but also because she was very poor. Now that head of Lincoln is by Gutzon Borglum. I knew Borglum right well. He was as temperamental as any artist could be. And he's the author of those huge figures on Mount Rushmore in South Dakota that you can probably see for 50 miles. It's really an amazing piece of work.
Outside this rotunda, the east front is where the presidents are inaugurated, isn't it?
That's right. 25 presidents have been sworn in there on the east front. And there they've given their inaugural addresses, rain or shine. Now here before the Capitol is where Lincoln said in his second inaugural, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Some historians say that in the balcony above Lincoln stood the assassin himself, John Wilkes Booth.
Senator, the rotunda is the dividing point between the House and the Senate, and when you left the House, it was a kind of a dividing point in your career, wasn't it?
Well, yes. House is behind us now, and the Senate is here in this wing. This is the part that was burned by the British in 1812.
Didn't you resign from the House?
Yes, I did. I developed eye trouble. They diagnosed it as chorioretinitis, which I suppose is rather common except for one thing. Those are those little hemorrhagic streaks on the eyes. They didn't know whether they were malignant or not. I finally had 5 or 6 physicians look after me. And I recall the morning they called up and got on a conference call and said half of them thought I ought to go to Johns Hopkins Hospital and have the surgeon over there look at me. Well, you can imagine the shock as it was, that maybe there had to be an eye removal. So I got on the train, and that's where it started my prayers. But when I got over to Johns Hopkins, the physician said, or the surgeon, well, are you ready for the enucleation? $64 word for taking out your eye. No, doctor, I said, I'm not. What do you mean you're not? Why'd you come here? Well, I said, before I got here, I got another doctor. Where'd you get another doctor? I said, while I was on the train. You couldn't have. Yeah, I said, it was easy. He's way upstairs. I asked him, oh, you're one of those guys, are you? I said, yeah, he talked to me. He said, don't let him take out your eye. All right, make up your mind. I'm going to California tomorrow. I'm going to be gone 3 months. I don't care if you're gone 3 years. I'm going to keep my eye. That's my good eye, see. And that was the story there. Then when I got back home, I quit, of course. I wanted to raise some flowers. I wanted to go back to a law office. And then the delegations began to come. You have to run. You have to run for the Senate. I said, I don't have to do a thing of the kind. They said, well, look, our governor was licked, our senator was licked by 500,000 votes. You have to run. I don't have to do anything kind. And then one night around the dinner table, I said to my wife and daughter, kids, after dinner, we're going into my study. And we're going to settle a question. Do I run or don't I run for the Senate? Each one gets 5 minutes under the House rule. And when you're through, we're going to vote. And when we vote, whatever that vote is, that's going to be it. So we voted, they voted aye, I voted no. I said, we run for the Senate, not I run for the Senate. That's how I landed there. And I've been there now quite a long time, and will soon be finishing 18 years in the Senate. Shows what happens to you.
People who believe in fate, that there are special places carved out for men, a man just has to hunt around until he finds it, may find their belief confirmed by Mr. Dirksen's career. Like a good many other men who worked in this building, like Lyndon Johnson and John Kennedy, not to mention Congressman Lincoln of Illinois, Dirksen made no real mark in the House of Representatives. He was one more stereotyped conservative with nothing remarkable to say and no appreciable influence. But when he officially crossed that rotunda from the House to the Senate, he was like a hand going into a well-fitted glove. The Senate was what he was born for. In the Senate, oratory and debate count. There's more scope for that quality that every good politician has to have, showmanship. There's more room for maneuver and for the subtle exercise of persuasion. President Franklin D. Roosevelt used to tell people who wanted to get something done, clear it with Sidney, meaning the great labor leader of that time, Sidney Hillman. Well, in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the rule of success has been clear it with Dirksen. He's not a senator, he is now the senator, the man who gets legislation passed or stopped. His residual conservatism shows occasionally in his campaign to cancel the Supreme Court's one-man, one-vote ruling and a few other lost causes. But he's also the man who made the difference in passing the Great Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Act of 1965, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, and much else of the legislation that is changing the United States.
To talk of the years and events during which he's gained national prominence, Senator Dirksen and I began our tour of the Senate wing of the Capitol in the ornate Senate reception room. Here, senators can come from the Senate chamber to visit with their constituents.
As long as you like.
Who are the senators whose portraits I see around the wall?
Well, now they're here because of a contest that was inaugurated, and I think the late John Fitzgerald Kennedy had something to do with it. These were blank ovals, and they decided that maybe some portraits ought to grace them. The question then was, who would you select? Who were in the judgment of those who were going to ballot on it, who were the great senators? And these are the five that finally turned up.
Henry Clay of Kentucky, and John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, Robert La Follette Sr. of Wisconsin, and Robert Taft of Ohio.
Now, you knew Taft.
Well, Taft I knew very well, and served when Taft was here, when he was the leader of the Senate. Now, he was a great person, had a brain, but he had been described as a real workhorse, and he was. The fellow just startled me at times by his capacity, both physical and mental. Taft was a giant in every sense of the word.
How do you think he would have done as president?
I think he would have made a great, great president. Now, you know, one who was competing for the limelight with Taft in that period was Arthur Vandenberg. I knew Vandenberg very well. We were sitting in his office one day. I knew that he did not get along with Taft. So I said, now, Arthur, as man to man, you tell me, what is your estimate of Bob Taft? Puzzled for a moment and finally said, probably the greatest senator who has come to the Senate in the last 50 years. So you see, coming from somebody who didn't get along too well with Bob Taft, that was a great compliment, I must say.
Behind us here, Howard, is the Senate lobby. In the past, people who wanted to petition Congress or the Senate or to listen to their grievances, they would come here in this lobby. And that's how that term started, lobbying. But today, the public is barred. Now, you'll note that directly off the lobby is the chamber of the Senate of the United States. There, the Vice President presides over the Senate. As in the House, the Republicans sit on his left, and the Democrats on his right. The desks, unlike in the House of Representatives, are assigned, and they are assigned according to seniority. Those with longest service get their pick. Now, on either side of the aisle, in the front row, are the desks of the majority leader and the minority leader, and those of the party whips. Now, even during sessions, the quiet appearance of the Senate chamber is quite deceptive, I can assure you. For in there, some of the great issues of our day have been debated.
What were to you the memorable issues here in your time?
Well, of course, civil rights, on which we worked for a long time.
That was 64.
Yes, but earlier than that. We started in 1959, and I had a great deal to do, I say that modestly, with every civil rights bill we ever had. But the major bill was the one that took most of our time, and in fact, was written in my office. Hubert Humphrey sat in, and the Attorney General and others, and we just plowed away around that table in my office until we finally got it written. And then, of course, I was ready to defend it on the floor. President Kennedy asked me about that and had me down at the White House a good many times. And I said, this won't do and that won't do, this will do. And we finally shaped it up and managed to sell it to the Senate. That was one thing. And then the nuclear treaty. I had gone back to read that article in the New Yorker written by John Hersey. Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And then I plowed around to get to later detail on it. I go back to that every once in a while. But thinking about it, the ghastly death, you know, it was an amazing thing. There was a river there, and actually the heat caused that river to boil. Well, people trying to escape that inferno rushed to the river and jumped in, didn't realize they were jumping into boiling water. So that's the ghastly and grim aspect of nuclear power when it's set in motion for that kind of a purpose. And I thought something has to be done about it. And I will devote what talent I have to getting this thing over if we can. I attended all the hearings, I heard all the experts, all the scientists, and I was willing to expose myself to every argument, pro and con, before I came to a final conclusion. So, there were other big issues also.
How do you take to the reputation you've developed? Originally, you were thought to be a right-winger. Now the left-wingers think you've done marvels.
They do that all because of probably one particular issue. But I am an Abraham Lincoln Garden variety, middle-of-the-road Republican. That's about as well as I can express it. Now, I ought to call attention to the fact, although you've already noticed that these beautiful chandeliers and the ornateness here. There's a room like this at the other end beyond the so-called marble room or the corridor. That is referred to as the president's room. Presidents used to come there and sign bills. And I believe President Lincoln was in that room when he received the message from Grant, evidently, that Lee was ready to petition and entreat for a cessation of hostilities and an armistice in the Civil War. 100 years later, in 1965, in this very room, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Bill into law. So you see, there's a strong link here between past and present events. The room is very quiet, and there's a dignity about it that befits our respect for the office of the presidency.
Senator, you've been here in the time of 5 presidents. Could you give me a little sketch of some of them? How about Franklin D. Roosevelt?
Well, I wasn't too intimate with Franklin Roosevelt. He called me on occasion to come down and witness the signing of a bill and give you a pen. I got to know President Truman much better. Probably the fact that he was a Midwesterner had something to do with it. But President Truman was very approachable. I looked on him as a neighbor, actually, next door, since he came from Missouri. Now, with Eisenhower, I got to see a good deal because we had these meetings every week, the so-called leadership meetings.
At the White House?
Yes. And I have occasion to call him every once in a while, particularly when he's at the farm in Gettysburg. And I like to just check with him from time to time. Then, of course, came John Kennedy, and he and I were great good friends. We served in the House, we served in the Senate, and had a lovely, gracious personality. And it was very common, but we were quite intimate, and he called me to the White House very frequently. And then, of course, with President Johnson, he and I got to know each other when he was a doorkeeper on the third floor in the House of Representatives. Later, he was elected to the Senate. Then he became Senate leader, and he was leader when I became leader. So we've had a lot in common over a period of years.
Senator, no one's had the experience who is now in the Senate that you've had. Why is it that President Kennedy seemed to have such bad luck with Congress and President Johnson had originally such good luck?
Well, I do not believe that President Kennedy had bad luck with Congress. It just took a little longer to get the things done that should be done because there was nothing imperious about President Kennedy. In other words, he relied entirely upon persuasion and on an entreaty in order to get you to see it from his side of the aisle. And quite often, with some modification, I could do that. The Civil Rights Acts were notable in that respect. And there was one nice thing about it. Every time that you carried the torch for him, he would call you up almost immediately to thank you without any intervening operator. Sometimes I'd get home, telephone would ring, and he'd say, "Ev, this is Jack." And I said, "Hi, Jack." Mrs. Dirksen gave me quite a scolding for that. Said, "You just don't refer to the president in that fashion. You refer to him as Mr. President." I said, "I'll never forget it."
This is the room where it all began. It was here in 1800 that Congress convened for the first time in the Capitol to listen to the address of our second president, John Adams.
Here's the old Supreme Court chamber, but maybe I ought to say the old Senate chamber, because they met here for about 40 years. You see, it was here in 1801 that Jefferson was inaugurated. And 2 years later, in 1803, the senators who occupied this chamber ratified the Louisiana Purchase. Supreme Court met here a long time, so we built them a nice, glossy, white marble building over across the way, and some really great decisions have been made in this chamber. If I remember rightly, I think the Monroe Doctrine was uttered here, too, under President Monroe. 1823, as I recall. And it has had an impact on our foreign policy from virtually that day to this.
Senator, sometimes they say that Congress's power is dwindling in relation to the president's power. Do you believe that's so?
I think you get that at times. Sometimes one is up and the other is down. At times you'll get a very assertive Congress and a president who is not so strong, and if I dare use the word, not so imperious. And they tell him off a little bit, you see, and then they assert themselves. Then maybe you get a stalemate. Of course, sometimes you get a stalemate between the House and Senate. Once we had this really interesting curiosity of two committees, appropriations of House and Senate,
yes, sir,
determining whether or not they were going to meet on that side or on this side. And finally, they picked out this chamber as sort of neutral ground. But there's one thing I don't want to forget, and that is what Webster said when we were dedicating the cornerstone of the Capitol, and when all the functions of government were up here, except that this part from 1812 on was immobilized for a time, because this is the part that the British burned. They brought all these documents and papers down here and set them on fire. What a cruel and heinous thing it was. I think I could still hate them for that, but I won't. But I think you'd be interested in what Daniel Webster said in 1851 when they were laying the cornerstone for the capital expansion. He said, "And all here assembled, whether belonging to public or private life, with hearts devoutly thankful to Almighty God for the preservation of the liberty and the happiness of the country, here unite in sincere and fervent prayers that this deposit and the walls and the arches and the domes and the towers, the columns now to be erected over it may endure forever. God save the United States of America." I think that's a magnificent theme. And this is a marvelous place.